Regular Monday gathering put forward by the John Locke Foundation. My name is Mitch Kokai, and we thank you for taking part in the Shaftesbury discussion. Again, it's going to be a very interesting topic we're going to get to in just a moment. Before we do, I want to advise you to be watching CarolinaJournal.com today for coverage of a number of issues. Our topic today has to deal with the courts and with crime and policing. A couple of big court issues of interest to North Carolina today. Of course, there's a confirmation hearing for the latest nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, and one of our own senators, Thom Tillis, takes part in the Judiciary Committee hearing on that issue. And then a second big issue of even more direct importance to North Carolina. Legislative leaders in North Carolina are before the U.S. Supreme Court as we're speaking right now. They are trying to get a chance to intervene in a federal case dealing with North Carolina's 2018 voter ID law. Carolina Journal will have coverage of both of those stories, so watch during the course of the day CarolinaJournal.com for coverage of both of those stories. Now back to today's topic. We've seen concern in recent years about rising crime rates. There's no universal agreement about the causes or even the best way to go about dealing with rising crime. But one topic that has attracted some attention recently is the rise of the so-called Progressive Prosecutor. What does that term mean? And what impact might a progressive prosecutor have on crime, police, and other law enforcement-related issues in his or her community? Well, we'll be discussing that topic during the next hour. We'll also learn about a different approach to prosecution, and we'll discuss a recent John Locke Foundation report that deals with the issue of policing. How might recommendations for a change in policing interact with prosecution? We'll get to that as well. So joining us for the conversation are Rafael Mangual. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and head of research for the Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative. Also joining us, Mike Miller. He is the elected district attorney for the Judicial District covering Cleveland and Lincoln counties. And John Guzay joins us. He's a senior fellow in legal studies at the John Locke Foundation. We want to thank all of you for joining us. And first, we're going to turn to Rafael. So I mentioned this term, progressive prosecutors. When we use that term, what do we mean, and how would they operate differently from a traditional prosecutor?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a term that I think gets taken for granted as something that most people understand, but that may not be correct. I mean, I think the best way to kind of define a progressive prosecutor is someone who uses his or her office to pursue reforms primarily, as opposed to the enforcement of the laws within that jurisdiction. And those reforms, move in a particular direction. They're aimed at decriminalization, decarceration, and depolicing. In other words, they're reforms that are basically aimed at lowering the transaction costs of criminal behavior while raising the transaction costs of criminal enforcement. And to really understand this, I think it helps to understand the origins of the progressive prosecutor movement. It's a movement that was launched really, I think, to address two issues. One is what's loosely referred to as police accountability. The other is to address what's referred to as mass incarceration. So in 2014, with the police shooting of Michael Brown by former police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri, we saw an elected DA decide not to pursue charges in that case. And I'm referring here to Robert McCullough, who was a multi-time incumbent. That decision was very highly criticized and received quite a bit of scrutiny in the media, and really drove a lot of concern about the role of local DAs in police accountability. And despite the fact that several investigations cleared Darren Wilson in that shooting, Wesley Bell decided to run a campaign around that issue and challenged Robert McCullough in a primary, defeating him. Despite not being, a seasoned prosecutor himself. And that was kind of one of the first dominoes to really fall. And, of course, cases like Tamir Rice and Eric Garner that, involved police killings that didn't result in prosecutions kind of really strengthened that movement. And we started to see, I think, a realization around the country that this was actually a viable avenue for broader reforms that aimed beyond just police accountability. And so In I think it was 2015, a professor by the name of John Pfaff at Fordham University released a book called Locked In. And the basic thesis of his book was that the mass incarceration problem, which he takes for granted as existing, really could be traced to a growth in the number of prosecutors in the United States and a growth in the percentage of cases in which prosecutors were pursuing felony charges. And so this book really caught on and in reform circles and got people to understand that you were going to have to reach much broader than just marginal decriminalization of, say, drug offenses in order to achieve the kind of decarceration that would satisfy the reform movement. And one of the effective ways to do that was through prosecutorial reform. And so I think those two things really drove a movement that has just expanded in scope to an enormous degree. I mean, the term progressive prosecutor was probably unfamiliar to most of America just 10 years ago. And now we're at a point in which nearly 50 million Americans are living in jurisdictions with self-described progressive prosecutors. To understand what that means for those places, I think it kind of helps to say just a little more about what kind of characterizes a progressive prosecutor in office. What you'll see is a lot of broad declination or non-prosecution policies. You'll see policies related to downcharging and an increase in the rate at which charges are kind of downgraded by the prosecutor before even entering into plea negotiations. You'll see a sort of de-emphasis on pretrial and post-conviction incarceration. So increases in diversion, increases in sentences of probation. You'll see more and broader support for parole. And so this, I think, kind of highlights two problems with the progressive prosecutor movement, and they're the kind of two central critiques I have of it as someone who kind of pays attention to these issues and writes about them as a policy journalist. And the first of those issues is that I think the progressive prosecutor movement is really anti-democratic in nature. What the reformers figured out was that rather than spend a lot of money on lobbying local officials and trying to pursue legislative reform, they could actually just dump much less money into a less visible but really consequential race, whereby you then have one person who essentially gets to unilaterally abrogate bodies of duly enacted legislation by choosing, at least within that jurisdiction, by choosing not to pursue cases that fall under those crimes that are disfavored. So that's one issue. The second issue, I think, is the public safety implications of the progressive prosecutor movement. Again, when you systematically lower the transaction cost of criminal behavior and raise the transaction cost of criminal enforcement, what you're doing is encouraging the sorts of behaviors that I think everyone wants to see less of. It becomes less costly to commit more crime. You're going to see more crime, and that goes to the deterrence issue that I think John's going to get into later on in the discussion. But beyond deterrence, there's also an incapacitation question that I think often gets left out of the conversation here. I mean, if you look at cities across the country, what you'll see is that a lot of the most serious crimes are driven by repeat customers, repeat offenders, people who have lengthy criminal histories and problematic criminal histories, often active criminal justice statuses at the time that they commit the offense. So, nationally, if you look at the 12-year period between 1990 and 2002, about 36% of all violent felons were either out on probation, out on parole, or out on pretrial release at the time of their most recent violent felony offense. In the city of Chicago, for example, which has been struggling with elevated levels of violence for quite some time, the average homicide or shooting suspect has 12 prior arrests. In New York City, we saw a nearly 27% increase in the percentage of violent felony arrests constituted by people with open cases after our bail reform, which a lot of progressive prosecutors are kind of pursuing on their own by just not pursuing pretrial detention in a lot of cases. So what that tells you when you start to see those kinds of numbers is that police seem to be doing a relatively good job of focusing their resources on the people driving serious crime, but the public safety benefits of that kind of enterprise get diminished if you don't have those efforts backed up by prosecution. So if we continue to see policies that will result in the quicker release or the non-incarceration of serious offenders, what you're going to see are more repeat offenders having an increase in the number of opportunities they have to commit serious crime. And of course, that crime's not going to be evenly distributed across any jurisdiction. it's going to be highly concentrated in the most vulnerable neighborhoods. I mean, any city in America, if you dig into the data, what you'll find is anywhere between 4 and 5% of the city street segments will see about 50% of all crime. About 3 to 4% of street segments will see about 50% of all violent crime. And so this is something that I think deserves our attention, and I'm really glad to be here discussing it with you all, and I'm glad that you all are raising awareness about it.
So Raphael has set the table now for us to describe what a progressive prosecutor is. We have on our panel someone who actually is a prosecutor, has to deal with these issues. Mike Miller is the district attorney in Cleveland and Lincoln counties. And first of all, before we get to some specific questions, I'd just like to ask you if you would tell us a little bit about what is the job as you see it? What are your responsibilities to the people within your judicial district?
Well, first of all, Mitch, thank you for having me. Let me apologize. I have a new computer, so I have a monitor above me, and I'm trying to look at my Zoom, and so I apologize for being distracting. Appreciate the time here together with you and the other gentlemen. Ultimately, my way I see my role is I work with the people of my district. I was elected to protect the people within my district, whether they're white, black, rich, poor, Republican, or Democrat. When you come to the courthouse, everybody should be treated relatively the same based on their unique circumstances and stuff. And that's what we try and do. We come to work every day to try and do that. A lot of things that Raphael said, I don't disagree with. There are certain things. The system's not perfect. But we can't paint with a broad brush all the time. And I think every district is unique. Every crime in and of itself is unique. Every defendant is unique based on their prior record, as he was alluding to, based on the elements of the crime. And then every state is unique too. We have the criminal code in North Carolina is different than it would be in California. The elements of the crimes are different. So when we see the evening news, I think those nuances are lost on a lot of the viewers and stuff. And understandably, I come from a blue-collar background. The evening news, people don't know what the elements of crime are because we don't discuss those. We're worried about raising our families and paying our taxes and things like that. That's my job. And so we do try and look at those things. In North Carolina, that's all I can speak to is, all crime is prosecuted by the state of North Carolina. And so we have a consolidated court system here, and I have since the 60s, I believe. So we don't have county courts, city courts, things like that. So any crime, whether it's a speeding ticket, a first-degree murder, comes to the district attorney's office. And I think we have 42 or 43 elected DAs in the state, and we're tasked constitutional officers to prosecute any crime on behalf of the citizens of our district, and that's what we try and do. So we do have a lot of discretion. We try and be judicious in that. We try and be fair with that. I don't go into work at any day and look at a file and say, okay, is this person a friend of mine? Is this person a thug? Are they white? Are they black? Or whatever. We try and look at the facts of the case, the evidence we have, and then they'll apply the law to that and try and figure out what is an appropriate way forward, whether it's a plea negotiation, whether it's a dismissal, whether it's a prosecution. So that's what I expect from my folks in my office, and that's what we come to work and try and do every day.
You've alluded to this to some extent, but it would be impossible for any district attorney, you or any of the others in North Carolina, or really any across the country, to prosecute every single crime that is charged. How do you go about setting the priorities? What makes you say this is something we definitely have to do, and these others, we want to get to them if we can, but we can't necessarily get to everything?
That's a good question, and one I've struggled with over the 20-some years I've been a prosecutor. And I probably have not approached it the best way, but I feel like I came from a fairly humble background, and I think if I was always raised to follow the rules. And so I come from the background of if you break the law, then you should pay the consequences of that. So we look at each case, but we don't dismiss a lot outright. We do occasionally, but it's usually based on an evidence problem. A lot of times we may think we've got the right person charged with somebody, But the role of the police officer and how they view things, the prosecutor may have a different lens we have to view it through, because part of that is, yes, do we have the evidence, but two, what are we going, can I convince 12 people of that? And so I have an ethical duty, not to, in my mind at least, not to take something to trial if I don't have a good faith basis that I can prove that. So that's one thing. So that weeds out some cases, but otherwise we try, and if there's evidence and then we feel like we can have a good shot at the trial, then it's unlikely we're going to take a dismiss. That being said, there are some cases that I just look at and say, you know, I just don't think that's going to pass muster. I'm not saying the person did not do it, but given, and COVID's kind of thrown a wrench in that too, because our courts were shut down for a few months and well, maybe a little longer than that, but so our backlog's gotten worse, and so we're grappling with that. But yes, it's not easy making, I shouldn't say it's not easy. We try and be judicious in reviewing the case, you're right. So we have to try and look at that. We do want to focus in an ideal world. If you break the law, you should be prosecuted. But if limited resources, we have to make some decisions at times. So we look at a person's prior record. Is this a repeat offender? Is this, you know, is this his first time? Is it a murder case, or is it a second-degree trespass? Things like that. And in district court, I won't bore you with the details, but district court in North Carolina at least, handles primarily misdemeanors without a jury. Those cases move fairly quickly. And so a lot of times things get weeded out in court because the victim may come in and they may have decided they don't want to prosecute anymore. So a lot of those cases do get dismissed more routinely, whereas in Superior Court, obviously there are felony cases. They get screened a little more in depth because we've got more time to spend on those. And so then we have to make a decision on, you know, is this person continuing danger to society? Usually it's a lot of the times, you know, maybe paper crime. Sometimes you look at that and say, well, in the ideal world, this guy would be prosecuted, but, you know, it's just maybe the bank doesn't want to cooperate or they don't want to send something. So that's the case. So we try and look at it. We look at every case individually and try and make decisions based on that.
Well, that's very helpful information, and probably one thing that a lot of us haven't thought about is the fact that if this is something you have to take to trial, it's something that you would have to convince a judge or a jury, if it's a jury trial, that this is something that they would go along with. So it's a slightly different calculation for you than it is for the officer on the street who's making a charge. We're going to get back to Mike Miller and to Rafael Mangual in just a bit, but I want to bring in our third panelist now, John Guzet, who is a senior fellow in legal studies at the John Locke Foundation. And John, before we get to questions, first of all, I want to thank you personally as the moderator of this forum, as the person who actually did the legwork in putting it together, lining up both of our additional panelists and actually helping us come up with what I think is going to be a very good program once all is said and done. John, we're going to get to some research that you have done in the issue of crime and policing. But before we do that, I want to ask you about your reaction to what you've heard so far about progressive prosecutors.
Well, I view this progressive prosecutor movement as part and parcel of a larger problem that's arisen. It started, as Rafe said, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, but it got much, much worse after the death of George Floyd. And what's happened is an extreme group of radicals, people I think, frankly, who want to tear down our entire system of laws and culture, they've just spread a lies about how crime and the criminal justice system operate in this country. And so we heard people talking about defunding the police. We heard people talking about abolishing prisons. And now we have progressive prosecutors saying we're simply not going to prosecute any larcenies below $900 or what have you. This kind of talk gives people the idea that crime isn't really a problem. The problem is racist police and systemic racism generally, which is the reason why so many people are behind bars, so many people are struggling with criminal records. I think this gets everything back to front. And in fact, I think this kind of talk and these kinds of actions are setting back the criminal justice reform movement in a serious way. In fact, just a few weeks, within days actually, of the anti-police riots breaking out in Minneapolis after George Floyd was killed, I wrote to all my friends in the movement. I said, this is going to set us back by years, because I know people on both sides of the political and ideological spectrum. We've been working together on sensible criminal justice reforms for years, but you've got to be realistic, and you've got to be honest, and you've got to take crime seriously. Crime is a huge problem, especially for Black people, especially for poor people in this country. To act as though we can simply stop enforcing criminal laws, let everybody out of prison, it's nonsense. And the harm that crime does already is profound. It's not just the victims and their families. It harms the quality of life in high crime communities, and it drives away investment, which is what you need to have jobs and prosperity in those communities. So criminals do immense amounts of damage. But even if we give, let's say, these progressive prosecutors the benefit of the doubt and say, well, they're not trying to tear down the country, they're just trying to, in a good faith way, reduce the number of people behind bars, reduce the number of people who have to struggle with criminal convictions, I think they're getting the wrong end of the stick. They're doing this in a terribly inefficient and ultimately counterproductive way. And if I can just segue to this report I recently wrote, there's a much, much better approach to this. And it draws on the old bit of old wives' wisdom, which says that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we can prevent crimes from being committed in the first place, everybody benefits. The potential victims benefit, the communities benefit, both because quality of life improves and there's more investment and more jobs. Even the would-be criminals benefit, because if they never commit those crimes in the first place, they don't spend time behind bars, they don't end up with criminal records. So it's a win-win. And the good news is that there's a wealth of information now. Many, many excellent studies have shown that, and it's just what common sense would suggest, police presence deters crime. If you have more police on the street, you have fewer crimes. We can reduce the amount of crime in this country simply by increasing the number of police officers. Rafe will tell you there's many other benefits of having more police. One of them is improving clearance rates and so on. But deterring crime, I think, is a very important benefit of more police. A lot of people don't realize it, but compared to most European countries, in fact, compared to most countries in the world, America has been under-policed for decades. We don't have as many police officers per capita as most other countries. We don't spend as much of our gross national product on policing as other countries. So what I've been advocating, and what my conclusion of this paper I wrote, is that we need to hire more police officers. We need to give them state-of-the-art training and support, and we need to deploy them as peacekeepers in high crime, high disorder communities. I think this will go a long way to solving even the problems that progressive prosecutors are worried about. And it'll also incidentally make life a lot easier for people like Mike, because there'll be fewer crimes and more core crimes, I think, for them to have to deal with.
For those of you who are watching the program on Facebook, which would be at facebook.com/John Locke Foundation, just a few minutes ago, linked in the comments to John Gouzet's report with the short headline, "More Cops, Less Crime." I want to give you the opportunity to read that report in full at some point after you watch our discussion today. John, before I get to both of our other panelists' reaction to your report, what would a progressive prosecutor mean for the implementation of the things that you're talking about? Are these two things incompatible, the ideas that you put forward in your report, and a progressive prosecutor who doesn't want to prosecute these types of crimes?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. I would hope that if they were, as I say, not an anti-American zealot who wants to burn everything down, but instead somebody who seriously wants to improve matters, not just for would-be criminals, but for everybody, then they would take this seriously. It's not facially incompatible with anything they're saying or doing. On the other hand, as we've heard, there's a lot of interaction between district attorneys and police officers. And if the DAs are giving the message that we don't want you out there, we don't want you trying to prevent crimes, at least certain categories of crimes. If the police pull back, which is what we've seen a ton of especially since we saw it after Ferguson, we saw a lot more of it after the anti-police riots that followed the killing of George Floyd. If the police pull back and they're not actively out there in the community, we get more crime. We especially get more homicides. We've seen a huge increase in crime and homicides in 2020, and it's going to be even worse in 2021. Where I live in Durham, North Carolina, homicides are up, I think 35% in 2021. Now, we have a fairly progressive district attorney there. I'm not saying she's the reason. There's lots of reasons, and it's a national problem. But if the DAs aren't supporting the cops and telling them what's expected, I don't know if it'll work.
Well, I will say, we're not going to place any blame on your prosecutor, but the district attorney in Durham, Satana DeBerry, was basically on Capitol Hill recently talking about these very issues. So she's
just last week, I think,
certainly part of this mix. I want to now ask both Rafael Mangual and Mike Miller. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you whether you've read all of John Gouzet's recommendations, but based on what you've heard from John, this idea of more police, certainly with the proper training, proper funding, how does that sound in terms of a way to help address the issue of crime? And what other factors do we need to keep in mind? And either one of you can go first.
I think that more policing is certainly going to be a core element of any successful crime control plan, particularly given how things stand now. As John noted, I mean, there is just a trove of research linking more police to lower rates of crime, both just by their presence, but also through their actions, right? I mean, when police officers make arrests, they are taking offenders off the street. That results in sometimes temporary, sometimes long-term incapacitation benefits, all of which get extended into the communities that they serve. And again, you know, those benefits are not evenly distributed, which is something I think gets ignored with respect to the systemic racism debate in our criminal justice system. John alluded to it earlier, but you know, what you often see in that debate is a hyper focus on disparities in enforcement outcomes, disparities in arrests, disparities in police uses of force, disparities in prosecutions and incarcerations. What gets left out of the conversation are disparities in the distribution of the benefits associated with the administration of criminal justice in the United States. We know from 1990 to 2014, there was a very sharp reduction in the United States homicide rate. Who benefited, right? That added about 0.14 years to the life expectancy of white men in this country. It added 1.0 years to the life expectancy of Black men in this country. You know, that is an incredibly disparate dispersion of the benefits associated with crime fighting that I think gets ignored. And, you know, if we just paid a little more attention to the other side of that ledger, I think the sort of systemic racism critique would be watered down quite a bit. You know, there was something also that the district attorney brought up about, you know, really appreciating the uniqueness of crimes and defendants. I think, you know, police officers, by virtue of their experience on the beat, do a pretty good job of exercising their discretion. And so, you know, when they're referring cases for prosecution, there's usually a pretty good reason for that. But, you know, just again, I think one of the major problems with the progressive approach to prosecution is that it really ignores the uniqueness, the idiosyncrasies of these cases, because that approach is characterized by broad and blanket policies. You know, we're not going to prosecute this kind of crime, no matter who commits it. It doesn't matter if the defendant's in the gang database and has 15 prior arrests and 7 prior convictions. It doesn't matter that this person is also accused of violating a protection order and, you know, has previous arrests for domestic violence. Right? I think, you know, to the extent that the research shows that more police will result in less crime, to the extent that that relationship continues to hold, I think is very largely dependent on the broader criminal justice system doing its part to back those policing efforts. I wrote a piece for the New York Post just a few months ago saying that refunding the police was necessary but not sufficient to combat the crime problem. And as the rest of the criminal justice system gets eroded, what you'll see is, again, police doing a great job of making these arrests, but the criminal justice system more broadly continuing to spit these bad actors back out into the street through a revolving door of justice, which is really going to diminish the impact that police can have over time. And, particularly on the deterrence front, right? I mean, the reason people run from police when they do is not because they don't want to be arrested and processed that day. It's because they don't want, to be imprisoned if and when they're convicted. As we diminish those punishments on the back end of the system, we're also going to impact the deterrence calculation of a lot of offenders. I mean, this is something I don't think enough people take seriously.
And I want our district attorney, if he would like to weigh in as well on this idea of more cops, less crime. You deal with officers throughout your work. Do you have any sense of whether there would be a major positive benefit for crime in the community if there were more cops on the beat in dealing with these issues?
Well, Mitch, one, I apologize. I lost audio there for a while, so I missed part of the dialogue. And again, I can only speak for my district. I think we have an adequate number of law enforcement here. And there are so many different issues we can discuss about law enforcement in general in the last 5 or 6 years post-Ferguson. But I don't think just, at least in my district, more police officers, or I think recruitment and retention in law enforcement in general is a different issue. But I do think that, Mr. Guzet, there is some evidence, and I don't think it's just anecdotal, that more law enforcement does reduce crime. And I picked up where Raphael was saying that the police are doing a good job out there as far as identifying that. I agree with that. The vast majority of law enforcement are good, honest, decent people, and they've been vilified, in my opinion, in the last 5 or 6 years, more so than normal. But most of them aren't blatant racist and things like that. Cops do make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are criminal, and as prosecutors, we don't turn a blind eye. They're not above the law. And I've had to prosecute some law enforcement officers, but life's about choices. If they make a bad decision, nobody's defending the Minneapolis or any of those people. The system works, and so I think we need to focus on that. But the problem with this issue is, I think where Ralph and I disagree is probably on the sentencing and things like that. I don't think making the sentences lighter will keep that man from running from law enforcement because he doesn't want to go to jail for an extended period of time. And I don't think there's enough time in this little segment of 1 hour to address a lot of the issues. I think a lot of that are the family unit is broken down a lot in our society, and we're not learning right from wrong to respect law enforcement. A couple of summers ago, we saw people dumping buckets of water on police officers in New York. All that does is demean that position, that officer's position, where folks don't respect police officers. And so therefore, when they come into court, we see them, they don't respect the court system in general. So I think we've gone from the fabric of society fraying to actually it's becoming unwoven now because the things that, while it's not a perfect system, if people don't respect the police officer and they don't respect the judge, and our whole criminal justice system is based on that premise that there's right and wrong in society. But for the last number of years, we basically, it appears at least, again, getting into the mainstream media, whichever one you want to watch, is that we're being told that the system is skewed against one demographic over another, and that we have a mass incarceration of folks based on the color of their skin, possibly. But, that tells people, young people in college, and I just read an article recently about Harvard where they didn't want this police substation in this one dorm because they felt intimidated by that. So what we're going to see, I think, in the next generation is more lawlessness. And maybe I'm being a little engaged in some hyperbole, but I'm afraid if we're not careful, we're going to end up with anarchy, because if we keep pushing law enforcement aside, then those folks, as we've seen in the rioting in the past summers, you take law enforcement away. And in Mr. Guzet's recent post, I think it was Montreal or somewhere back 30 or 40 years ago, the police officers went on strike and they ran amok for a few weeks. And, when you talk about these quality of life crimes, breaking into a small mom and pop store and stealing stuff out of that may be small to the people at the NBC and stuff, but for that person who owns that store, that's their livelihood. And if you smash out the windows and steal all their stuff out of it, you know, what does that person do? Or you steal all the tennis shoes out of the store next to it and say, well, they're entitled to that. That's not what our system is about. It's about law and order. And where there's if we don't follow that, then the next person will say, well, you know what? I saw them on TV. They didn't do anything. They burned down a police car. I'm going out and getting my share too. If that's what's going to happen, then nobody's going to be safe. So I think it's a very slippery slope, and if we're not careful, in the interest, and I think that I hate to use terms, but since we're using it, progressive prosecutors and those folks on that side, some of them do have good intentions, I think, and they really feel like that maybe there's some system that the system there's a systemic racism problem. But for 20 some years, I've come to work every day. I never look and see if there's a W for white or B for black on my file. I look at the facts of that case. And we prosecute regardless of the white, black, rich or poor, Republican or Democrat. If you violate the law in my district, that's all I'm interested in. I don't care about what color you are or what your social status is. And so I think we need to get away from that and try and look at the fact is, you know what? This person broke the law. They're the ones who did the wrong thing. But it looks like to me, again, looking at the mainstream media, the police and law enforcement and the court systems are now on trial, not really the perpetrators of the crime. And if we're not careful, that's going to get away from us, and then nobody is going to excel in a system where there's anarchy, other than the anarchists themselves.
That is the voice of Mike Miller. He is the elected district attorney for the Judicial District that includes Cleveland and Lincoln counties. I mentioned a bit earlier, if you're watching us on the John Locke Foundation's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/John Locke Foundation, you could find a link in the comments to John Gouzet's report, More Cops, Less Crime. I should also mention that if you'd like to ask a question to one of our panelists, you could submit it through the comments at facebook.com/John Locke Foundation. If we have time at the end of the segment, we'll have a chance to get to your questions. I want to go back now to Rafael Magwal. First of all, if you'd like to respond to any of the comments that DA Mike Miller had, that would be fine. But I also want to ask you about the prevalence of this progressive prosecutor approach. I mean, we've heard about it in large blue cities, but just how prevalent is this across the country? Is it in places that we might not expect?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I think we shouldn't be surprised by the growth of the progressive prosecutor movement over time, given how successful early efforts at winning some of these elections have been. I think the big blue cities do get quite a bit of attention. St. Louis County, I guess, could qualify as one of those jurisdictions, but, it's certainly not, New York or Chicago. But we are seeing this sort of make its way into more kind of, suburban and exurban areas. Northern Virginia, there were a few counties in which progressive prosecutors had quite a bit of success in the last election cycle. And we're also starting to see that movement kind of make its way into the federal government, which is something that's particularly troubling because, in a lot of these jurisdictions, U.S. attorneys have kind of been a bit of a bulwark against local progressive DAs. And we saw that with U.S. Attorney Bill McSwain in Philadelphia after the election of Larry Krasner, where McSwain was starting to take as many cases as his office could handle where there was concurrent jurisdiction, and the police were very happy to sort of reroute those cases there. We saw that here with the NYPD as well, especially for cases in Brooklyn where there was concurrent jurisdiction. But now with the Biden administration, we've seen the appointment of some U.S. attorneys who are progressive prosecutors themselves. Rachel Rollins, the progressive DA formerly of Suffolk County in Boston, Massachusetts, has now been appointed to a U.S. attorney seat. As that happens, I think it's going to have some real major implications for what this looks like. Like I said, 10 years ago, you could maybe count on one hand the jurisdictions that had something that could be described as a progressive prosecutor. Now we're talking somewhere between 40 and 50 million Americans living in these jurisdictions. And I think that number is only going to go up, in part because I think it takes some time for the public to adjust. And a lot of these races are very low visibility races that are decided in off-year elections. And it's really the primary that decides the outcome of the race in a lot of these jurisdictions. One of the more common factors in jurisdictions with progressive prosecutors is that they're essentially one-party jurisdictions. Where you have Democrats sort of winning out for some years, and so whoever wins the primary really ultimately wins the general in these places. And with a relatively small amount of money, you can win a primary in a lot of these places. And so I think New York's a really good example of that. I mean, I think we had maybe 21% of the electorate show up for the Democratic primary in the Manhattan DA race, which Alvin Bragg won. He's our progressive prosecutor here in New York City, or one of at least two. Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn is another, but Larry Krasner won re-election with I think 17% of the eligible vote in the general. So until the voting public kind of catches on to this issue and decides to become more active, I think we're going to see this movement continue to grow. It may grow more slowly. And I think that's encouraging, but I would expect that the scope of the progressive prosecutor movement is gonna broaden over time.
We're getting back to our prosecutor in just a bit, but I want to loop John Guzet back in at this point. And John, you follow in the courts and in the news what's happening with prosecution and with crime and policing in North Carolina. Do you have a sense that we're seeing some of the impact of this progressive prosecution, as we've described it, taking place here in North Carolina? Any evidence of that you can point to, or that you see there's a potential for?
Well, there definitely is. It's happening here. I mentioned my own district attorney in Durham County, and I think in the western part of the state, we've seen some of the same kinds of statements by prosecutors listing crimes they're not going to prosecute. Now, sometimes I think that's a legitimate response to a lack of manpower. When you can't fill the slots in your police force, you can't do as much as you would like. But I also think there's some ideological motivation behind this. I will say this: if there's a silver lining in what's happening with progressive prosecutors, it's that more people will maybe start paying attention to the office. Rafe mentioned that you get low turnout for these votes, but I think maybe turnout's going to start to be higher when people realize this is happening, and that would be all to the good. Mike wasn't really doing himself sufficient credit when he talked about his role, because district attorneys are right at the heart of everything that's happening in the criminal justice system and making it work the way it ought to work. They decide which parties to charge, and they have to sign off on any plea bargains. They decide how they're going to organize and run the prosecution when it happens. They make recommendations to judges about pretrial release conditions. They work with victims groups or with victims to ensure that they get what they ought to get in terms of information and restitution. They're just crucial to the whole process. And so voters ought to take those races more seriously than they do. And I guess I'm sort of hoping that when they read about these outrageous activities by woke prosecutors in places like San Francisco and New York, they'll think, well, I better pay attention to who's running in my county.
Thanks, John. So we want to loop back in now Mike Miller, who is the elected district attorney in the Judicial District that includes Cleveland and Lincoln counties. That's your focus. You have a busy enough job worrying about issues of crime in your community and how to address it. But I assume that you spend at least some of your time interacting with your peers across the state. So are you hearing about different approaches to prosecution in different parts of the state? And if so, does that have any impact on the way things operate in Cleveland and Lincoln counties?
Mitch, I watch the news like anybody else, although I try not to do it too often. Sometimes it's depressing, but I've seen over the last couple of years, usually in the larger cities of San Francisco, LA, the prosecutors coming out and making statements where we're not going to prosecute this type of crime, period. And they're a constitutionally elected officer. I totally respect that. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good fit for my district, the people I represent. I think the problem with that is yes, we do have a tremendous amount of discretion. And as Raphael and Mr. Gouze said, that, you know, I think it is important you know who your DA is, regardless. If you're on the left, then you probably want a progressive. If you want people out of jail, if you don't want people prosecuted, if you're concerned about public safety and the safety of your community, then you need to know who that is, because that is a very important. And typically, having to run for the job, I'm usually on page 2 and on the ballot, and nobody knows who you are, and nobody really cares who you are. That can be nice in a way, but ultimately, as a citizen of the district I live in, I want to know what's going on, and so it is important for people to know who's running for DA, because now more than ever, because some of these folks that are progressive, while some of their ideas may be good, I think ultimately their ideas, most of them, again, painted with a broad brush, are not conducive to orderly society. And so I do not think it's right to come out personally and say, I'm not going to prosecute a larceny for less than $900, whatever the example was. What that tells me is every little store in my district, they're fair game for somebody to go in and clean out all their whatever, just as long as they don't go over $800. Who absorbs that loss? If it's a chain store, you may say, well, they can afford that. No, really, they just distribute that loss to everybody else that shops at that store around the state. And so there's no such thing as a private or hidden crime or sin. We all pay for it somehow. And so I think that while I might look at that case and say, you know what, in my discretion, based on whether my caseload, my ability, number of people I have working here at the time, I may choose not to prosecute them. That's different than just coming out in the media and saying, you know what, anything under $900 is fair game. Because the bad guys watch the news too, and they know that if they hear that, then there's no restraint on their behavior at all then. Because they can just go in and walk into the store and, like we see on the news, push a grocery cart out. That's devastating to the local economy. And, a rising tide lifts all ships. So if the economy in my area is doing well, ultimately the crime is going to go down some. Not always, because you're going to have some bad actors who just are criminals. Some people commit crimes due to financial problems. Now, that's a whole different area, so we won't spend a lot of time in those weeds. But I think it's a bad policy to come out and say, I'm just not going to prosecute this type of crime. Now, the legislature inadvertently can create some of that stuff, and sometimes we've seen that here as far as with marijuana and stuff. That's a totally different issue, but it's still, I think you're going to see most prosecutors, I don't think, are going to come out and say, I'm not going to prosecute this type of crime, period.
I'd like to ask you, while you still have the floor, you are a DA, you've worked with the system, worked with the process. Are there some particular types of reforms, either in law enforcement or in the way the courts are set up and in what district attorneys have to do? Are there some reforms you would like to see that would make your job better, more efficient, more effective?
When you say reforms, can you narrow that down a little bit as far as what type of reforms or in what areas?
Just anything that you have to deal with on a daily basis that you say, if we did this differently, or maybe it's just you upgrade a computer system or something like that, something that would make the job of the DA in Cleveland and Lincoln counties and the other DAs across the state, something that would make life better for you and make it easier to do the job that you are supposed to do?
The last 2 years has been just extraordinary times for all of us. It's just, I've never in my lifetime, or I guess none of us have, where most of our society was shut down by the government. And yet crime, while maybe taking a brief hiatus initially, picked up the pace a lot quicker than the court system picked up the pace to keep up with it. So, and I think the state of North Carolina is doing all it can as far as that, since that's who works for me, as far as providing those resources. But you can't increase the court system overnight. You can't just create more judges. All that's a legislative process. They can put more money into it. But in my opinion, right now, we just need more bandwidth. And that doesn't happen because you can't just say, give the DA more assistant prosecutors. Because then if you're going to do more trials, you need more judges, you need more clerks, you need more of everything. And so that's not
space too.
That's right. Not an easy answer. I mean, both of I live in a fairly rural area. The one courthouse is 120 years old. And so we've been struggling with, a very small, and we're getting ready to move into a new courthouse in a couple of months. But so there are no easy answers on that. But right now, if I had a magic wand, I would like to have more space and more bandwidth so we can move cases simultaneously.
All right. Well, certainly that's something that people will need to keep in mind. Just as all of these things are being considered, if you're going to have more crimes or want to have more prosecution, you're going to need to have more space, more bandwidth, as you just said.
We need more jail space too. I know that's probably where Raphael and I disagree on some things, but while there's a discussion with who's in jail and pretrial release, things like that, we just, unfortunately, as long as people are committing crimes, we need somewhere to house them. And so as the crime increases, I know once a school of thought is, well, you just let those people out on pretrial release. I ascribe to the theory that we just need a bigger jail to hold those people to keep the community safe while we're disposing of their case.
I want to turn back to Raphael again. So we've talked about this issue of the progressive prosecutor based on the definition you set at the outset. Is this the type of issue you think that is going to be getting better, getting worse, mixed bag, hard to tell? What's your assessment of where things stand with the so-called progressive prosecutor today?
I think it's hard to tell, mostly just because this is still a very young phenomenon, right? Like I said, prior to 2014, the term progressive prosecutor hadn't even entered the general lexicon yet. So it's really only been a few years, I don't think we quite know how people are going to react. It's also been, probably too short a time in a lot of these jurisdictions to even have the data to assess, how things are going under their watches. We have some of that, but one of the things that I think, you tend to find out really quickly when you try to sort of isolate the causal mechanisms at play is that it's really hard to sort of suss out what role the prosecutor's decisions are playing in the broader crime picture, particularly because, as was noted earlier, we're in the middle of a broader reform movement. The New York Times reported midway through last year that between George Floyd's murder and April of 2021, there were something like 130 police reforms passed by 40 states across the country. In addition to that, we've seen lots of other legislative reforms aimed at, sentencing, things like, sentencing reductions, like bail reforms, like parole reforms. Here in New York, they just passed something called less is more, which makes, the pursuit of a technical violation and the revocation of release more difficult to achieve. So as all of those things happen at the same time, in addition to a police recruitment and retention crisis, I think it's going to be really, really hard for critics of the progressive prosecutor movement like myself to be exact and specific about just how much harm that movement's doing. And I think what effect that's going to have ultimately is it's going to sort of delay any kind of informed backlash that might have otherwise been seen, had not so many other things been going on. I guess if I would really pin down to answering this question more directly, I would say I think things are going to get worse. I think we're going to see the movement grow in scope. How long that lasts, though, I think is an open question. There are some, data points that I think are worth noting. In Baltimore, for example, the progressive DA there, Marilyn Mosby, she took office in January of 2015. Through 2020, that city has seen 111 more homicides annually than the 6-year period prior to Mosby coming into power. If you look at Chicago, which is another jurisdiction that's had a progressive prosecutor for quite a while, Kim Foxx took office in December of 2016. So if you look at 2017 through 2020, there were 90 more homicides annually than there were between 2013 and 2016, which was the 4-year period before she took office. Philadelphia, Larry Krasner took office in January 2018. In the 3 years between 2018 through 2020, that city's seen 112 additional homicides annually compared to the 3-year period before he took over. So, make of that what you will. I don't think you can lay that entire increase at the lap of, the progressive prosecutor in those jurisdictions, but I can't think of any jurisdictions with progressive prosecutors that have been in office for a number of years that have seen things move in the right direction on the crime front. And I think that's, that's worth considering. There's this kind of trend in the criminal justice reform movement where people pursuing decarceration and depolicing have a really high evidentiary bar before they roll any of those reforms back. But the bar is not quite so high for the enactment of those reforms in the first place. And I think, that way of thinking has to get rebalanced before we see, any kind of sort of measured pullback from the progressive approach.
Well, the time is running down in our hour, but I do want to give the other two panelists an opportunity to give some final comments as well. So I want to go first back to District Attorney Mike Miller. And as we've been talking about this issue of progressive prosecutors, we've certainly been talking about one subset of them. When you talk to people about district attorneys, either it's your office or your colleagues and peers across the state, what is it that you want them to know about the DA, the DA's role in the judicial criminal justice system, and why it's so important?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, as Mr. Guzay pointed out, I mean, it is a very important position for the community in which they serve. And that's why I'm very concerned about the quote progressive movement, because what I see them doing is making their communities less safe. My number one job is to assist law enforcement in keeping our community safe. That's safe for everybody. Again, it's Republican, Democrat, black, white, everybody. We don't pick and choose who we're trying to keep safe, nor does law enforcement. And so that's my number one message to the community is you need to know who you're voting for, because culturally we may have some nuanced differences in our communities, but ultimately we all want our communities to be safe. We want grandma and them to be able to sit on their porch in the evening in the city and enjoy the evening or whatever, not worrying about a stray bullet coming through and killing somebody on the porch or a baby sleeping in the house. These progressive DAs are setting the table for those types of crimes to flourish. And I'm hopeful, and Raphael may be right, it might take a while, but I'm hopeful that we'll see some of that correct maybe in November when you look at some of the statistics of some of these districts that have a progressive DA. There'll be enough data in it to look at that. The problem is most people get their news through the mainstream media. And unfortunately, it seems like depending on which channel you watch, maybe which version you get. And I think sometimes they want to protect their own if you're a liberal station or a conservative station. And, it used to be the media was they kept everybody in check in politics. They did their due diligence, they did their research, whether it's the Nixon, things like that. Now it doesn't seem like we don't have any journalists left anymore. They don't want to dig if it's on their side. They just kind of cover that up. And I'm afraid that they're not going to point out some of these districts where things are not looking so great in some of these blue cities and point out, what, this may be more than you voted for. And if we don't bring that out and people don't dig on their own, which most people don't, the people in this panel here obviously have an interest in that. So they look like Raphael, he's got all kinds of data in his brain. But most people aren't like that. And so they rely on the evening news or the newspaper to bring that out. And I don't think we can trust that. And so if that's the case, I think we're going to see more progressive DAs being elected. And I think that's unfortunate.
All right, I'm going to give the final word to John Guzay on this. John, you've, as we talked about earlier, done a lot of work on crime and policing. But I want to ask you, just how important is it for the legal system, criminal justice system, to get this issue of prosecution right? We hear a lot about cops. We hear some amount about judges. We don't hear as much about prosecutors. Should people be paying more attention?
Well, they should. And I guess to make my final point, I want to circle back to something Rafe said earlier. We need to focus on the victims. I think the way to get people's attention and to make them understand how important this is to emphasize the victims. We hear all the time about people who are killed by police officers, something like 1,000 a year. Most of those are justified killings, there's no question. So it's only a handful where there might be some wrongful behavior by the police. In 2020, over 20,000 Americans were murdered by other Americans, and over half of them were Black Americans. This is what I find it hard to give them credit for good faith these progressives, the people who want to defund the police and abolish the prisons and stop prosecuting certain crimes, I find it hard to give them credit for good faith when I consider the hypocrisy of they're using the slogan Black Lives Matter, and yet they're ignoring the fact that Black Americans are more than 7 times more likely to be homicide victims than white Americans. That should be unacceptable. We need to focus on the victims, and if we do that, maybe we can get the public's attention and have them make the changes that need to happen in order to do something about the situation.
Well, it's certainly an important topic, one that deserves far more discussion than we're able to have in the course of an hour, but we definitely thank those who took part in this conversation during the past hour. Rafael Mangual is Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and Head of Research for the Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative. Mike Miller is the elected district attorney for the Judicial District that covers Cleveland and Lincoln counties. And you just heard there John Guzet, Senior Fellow in Legal Studies at the Locke Foundation. We thank all of you for participating, and we thank you for watching this edition of the Shaftesbury Society. If you like what you are hearing in these weekly events and would like to contribute to the John Locke Foundation, you certainly can by going to johnlocke.org and looking for opportunities to donate there. Thanks so much for taking part and listening to the conversation today, and we'll be back again in another week with another edition of the Shaftesbury Society.